From Florence, Italy, the city of inspiration for sculptors in ages past and for centuries to come, you're listening to The Sculptor's Funeral.
Good day to you all, and welcome to The Sculptor's Funeral, the podcast for figurative sculptors here, there, and everywhere. I am your host, Jason Arkles, a sculptor and art historian plying his trade in Florence, Italy, where all the great sculptors are dead, and I don't feel so well myself. And today, we're going to dive into the history of a single sculpture, which was produced in the aftermath of the death of Alexander the Great and the subsequent fracturing of Alexander's Macedonian Empire. Now, this statue, which we all know as the Colossus of Rhodes, was so amazing and improbable that some today who have heard of it assume that it never actually existed, that it is merely a part of Greek myth, just one more legend in popular culture like dragons and zombies, which, like the Colossus of Rhodes, was appropriated by fantasy author George R.R. Martin for his book series A Song of Fire and Ice, which of course was made into the popular TV show Game of Thrones. Now, in that series and TV show, the harbor of the port city of Braavos is dominated by a bronze statue hundreds of feet high, straddling the harbor so that ships entering the harbor pass between the legs of this statue, and it was known as the Titan of Braavos. However, unlike dragons and zombies, the prototype for the Titan of Braavos actually existed. Now, it's true, the historical bronze giant known as the Colossus of Rhodes wasn't hundreds of feet high, and it's certain that the statue never straddled the harbor and no ships ever passed through its legs. But that should not diminish the incredible accomplishment of the creation of the Colossus of Rhodes, a sculpture that would not be rivaled in scale for 2,000 years, and one that is on the very elite list of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, which included the Great Pyramids of Egypt, the lighthouse at Alexandria, and the seated statue of Zeus by Phidias. So let's set the stage a bit for this wonder of a statue. Now, what kind of culture even imagines to create, much less undertakes, something like the Colossus of Rhodes? Throughout history, there is generally one answer to that question. It's going to be a wealthy culture, a wildly successful culture, a culture which had faced daunting challenges and had triumphed, a culture which, in the wake of its triumph, becomes so filled with hubris that the collective will dares attempt to manifest its wildest dreams and imaginings. And such was the culture of Greater Greece during and after the reign of Alexander the Great. Now, in episode 82, I touched briefly upon the life of Alexander the Great, the king of Macedonia who conquered not only all of Greece, but also Asia Minor, Egypt, the Middle East, and much more, in a series of unending victorious battles. When Alexander died in 323 BC, his newly enlarged kingdom was divided up into 4 major regions, controlled by 4 of Alexander's old generals, who, of course, fought with each other over borders and territories for 40 years, before finally settling into established sub-empires. Now, the period in which Alexander the Great lived was exceptional. Alexander himself, always victorious in battle, seemed capable of anything. And he wasn't just popular. He was practically revered as a god during his life and after his death. Cults of worship sprang up wherever he went. And Alexander, of course, encouraged this worship, even going so far as to sometimes dress as a god for special occasions and feasts. His victories and conquests were on such a large scale that they dwarfed all other previously celebrated victories. I mean, what was the victory of Athens over Persia in the 4th century, for instance, compared to Alexander conquering all of Greece and Asia Minor in a matter of a few years? And of course, that was just the beginning of his conquests. As far as the peoples of the Mediterranean were concerned, Alexander was the ruler and the savior of the world, or as one art historian has put it, the Jesus before Jesus. With Alexander in the lead, anything was possible. Now, when someone is seen as being invincible and omnipotent, others, allied with that mighty personage, tend to imagine that power rubbing off on them somewhat, as though the followers of Alexander themselves were capable of tremendous exploits simply by proxy. One such associate of Alexander was Dinocrates of Rhodes. Now, Dinocrates is most remembered today for several architectural accomplishments, including the layout of the new city of Alexandria in Egypt, named, of course, after Alexander, like some 60 other cities throughout Alexander's realm. Dinocrates of Rhodes also built the Funeral Pyre for Alexander's beloved childhood friend and later general, Hephaestion. And this funeral pyre was made of stone, 6 stories tall, and covered completely in gilding, and then set on fire. But Dinocrates is also remembered for his personal audaciousness and ambition. He came to Alexander's court as an unknown and wanted to attract the attention of Alexander after having failed to arrange a formal introduction. So, according to the Roman architect Vitruvius, Dinocrates stripped naked, covered himself in oil, and wearing nothing but a crown of laurels and a lion skin draped over his shoulders, basically wearing a Hercules costume is what he's doing, he enters the court, naked, oily, with a lion skin. And that got Alexander's attention, and once he had it, Dinocrates immediately offered to build Alexander a wondrous city in his honor upon Mount Athos on the coast of northern Greece. And this city was to be like no other. For according to Dinocrates' vision, the entire face of Mount Athos was to be carved into a gigantic figure of Alexander himself, a figure so large that the proposed city would be held in one hand of this statue, and with the other hand, the gargantuan figure would be pouring out from a jug a mighty river which would flow to the sea. Now, the city on Mount Athos was never built, of course, though Alexander did like the idea, but he shot the plans down because Dinocrates had failed to take into account that this new city had no land with which to grow crops and to feed itself. Instead, Dinocrates intended that the city rely on importation for its food supply, which Alexander found most impractical. It's probably not the only reason the city didn't get built, but that's the story. Now, like many stories from that time, it may not be true. But even if it's only a legend, it's a legend which demonstrates the hubris of the times inspired by Alexander. So, with that as a backdrop, let's look at the island of Rhodes, the home of Dinocrates, and learn the history of that island's wealth and success against its enemies, which led to the city to contemplate the construction of the Colossus of Rhodes, happening just a few decades after the audacious proposal of Dinocrates. The island of Rhodes is the largest of a group of Greek islands known as the Dodecanese, which means the 12 islands. There's more than 12 islands, actually, but there's a chain of 12 larger islands along with many smaller ones. And this chain of islands extends far away from the mainland of Greece, stretching along the southern coast of Asia Minor, which is today Turkey, but in the past was once the Persian Empire, and then later, after the death of Alexander, it was known as the Antigonid Kingdom, named after Alexander's general Antigonus, who claimed that territory in the Wars of Succession, which followed Alexander's death. Now, Rhodes is the name of both the island and the name of the only large city on the island, which is where we find its main harbor and port. Now, the island of Rhodes is not only the largest of the Dodecanese, but also the easternmost, the farthest from mainland Greece, and as such was a strategically important military and trading outpost for the Greeks, for Asia Minor, basically the eastern half of the Mediterranean. Rhodes was wealthy due to trade, and maintained a large navy, which effectively controlled passage from the Mediterranean into the Aegean Sea. Now, wisely, Rhodes had trade agreements with all the major powers in the region, which secured its independence. And everyone knew that trouble for Rhodes would spell trouble for trade. But, as Rhodes lies not far off the coast of the Antigonid Kingdom, that meant it would be a very valuable possession for King Antigonus. However, despite being physically proximate to Asia Minor and the Antigonid Kingdom, Rhodes already had a special alliance with the Ptolemaic Kingdom, which controlled Egypt, ruled over by yet another of Alexander's old generals, Ptolemy. Now, together, the city of Rhodes and the kingdom of Ptolemy more or less dominated trade throughout the Mediterranean. Rhodes wasn't a possession of the Ptolemaic kingdom. It operated independently, more or less, but it was under the de facto protection of Ptolemy due to their shared trade interests. But King Antigonus wasn't happy with this alliance so close to his shores, and so when Rhodes refused an offer to switch alliance from Ptolemy to Antigonus, Antigonus sent his son Demetrius to take Rhodes by force. As the saying goes, if you can't join them, beat them. Now, the siege of Rhodes in 305 BC did not win any friends for the kingdom of Antigonus. It disrupted trade for a year for all the other kingdoms, for one thing. It was also largely viewed as an act of piracy on Demetrius's behalf, because the object of the siege was not merely to occupy or annex Rhodes, but to plunder it and reduce its power. In addition to the naval fleets from the Antigonids, Demetrius recruited over 1,000 actual pirate ships to help aid him in the blockade of the island and the siege of the capital city. Now, occupation of the island was easy for Demetrius's forces, but the city of Rhodes itself and its harbor were heavily fortified. Rhodian ships were successful at running the blockade, and so the town was able to replenish its food supply. The siege and eventual taking of the city became the main goal for Demetrius, and to this end, he used all the usual siege tactics of the day. He undermined walls, he was using catapults and battering rams, but Demetrius also employed the most fearsome weapon of that century against the walls of Rhodes, a war machine known as the Helepolis, the taker of cities. To describe the Helepolis is difficult to do without sounding, again, like you're describing a fantasy film. It's exactly the sort of weapon you might see in Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones, and naturally assume it's just overblown fantasy. But the Helepolis was very real. Essentially, it was similar to a siege tower on wheels, a wooden construction that your army would roll into position next to a city's walls. Your army would then scramble up the staircases located inside the tower, and then come out on the top, and then climb down into the city on the other side of the walls. Simple enough. That's a siege tower. But a Helepolis, a taker of cities, was much more. The Helepolis built by Demetrius was about 130 feet high and about 65 feet to a side. That's over 40 meters high and 20 meters wide. The wheels it was mounted on were 15 feet high. It was an enormous 6-story wooden tower, and mounted inside this tower were 6 stories of catapults, 2 or 3 on each level. The catapults on the lowest level were capable of hurling stones weighing 180 pounds or 70 kilos. But even the smallest catapults up at the top of the tower could throw 30-pound stones, enough to smash in a roof, breach a wall, or obliterate a soldier. The Helepolis required thousands of men to operate. Just to move the war machine, it took over 1,000 men to push it, while inside the tower itself, 200 men turned an enormous capstan, which slowly turned the tower's wheels. To call this thing formidable is an understatement. But, lest you think that all the city of Rhodes would need to do was to set the Helepolis on fire, that was easier said than done, as the entire tower, all 4 sides, 130 feet high, 65 feet wide, were clad in bronze sheathing. The entire apparatus, empty of men, weighed over 160 tons. And yet, the walls of the city of Rhodes were not breached. Demetrius tried for over a year, but with the continued disruption of trade and the general sympathy of the major powers of the Mediterranean landing on the side of Rhodes, not to mention the efforts of the Ptolemaic kingdom to aid and resupply Rhodes, Demetrius decided to declare victory and go home. In the peace accord between the Antigonid kingdom and Rhodes, Rhodes promised to remain neutral, which is what they had already been anyway, and Demetrius agreed to abandon all his weapons and siege equipment, including the fearsome Helepolis. In the end, the only thing the siege of Rhodes really accomplished was to diminish the standing of the Antigonid kingdom in the region, while strengthening the relations between the Ptolemaic kingdom and Rhodes, and finally to solidify the status of Rhodes as fully and peacefully independent. Now, Rhodes was an island of traders and merchants, not of pirates and empire builders. They had little use for the siege equipment that was now theirs, except to scrap them for their raw materials. Now, I mentioned that the Helepolis, the 6-story taker of cities, was clad in bronze. Now, what in the world would Rhodes do with all that extra metal? We'll get to that when the sculptor's funeral continues. Hello, everyone. I hope everyone's new year is off to a good start. There's a new president in the White House. There are COVID-19 vaccines coming out. So, if anything, there seems to be a faint glimmer of light at the end of this tunnel the world has been in the last year. As for me, I'm doing all right, safely ensconced in my Florence studio. Obviously, I did no touring workshops in 2020, in stark contrast to the dozens I did all over the world in 2019. Sadly, it looks like things will not get back to normal for the summer of 2021 either. Though I am scheduled to give a figure modeling workshop at Brook Green Gardens in South Carolina this June, and I have hopes it'll happen. But of course, everything depends on vaccinations and travel restrictions, and who can say what the situation will be in 5 months. So wish me luck. And if you're interested, you can go to the Brook Green Gardens website and sign up for the course, or even to the pitiful little page on thesculptorsfuneral.com, which lists my one travel workshop for this year. In the meantime, I'll take in any student who can find their way to Florence. I have had very few students over the last year, and you know what? I think I kind of miss you guys. So come if you can. Take care of yourselves and each other, and keep sculpting and keep learning. And we'll see each other again soon, I'm sure. Now, the city and island of Rhodes, being prosperous and peaceful, didn't really know what to do with all their new wealth at first, and there was no pressing need to spend the windfall that they reaped from the sale of these siege engines and materials that they scavenged from them, which by Pliny the Elder's estimate actually totaled about 300 talents, which in today's money would equal about $360 million. A talent, you see, was a measure of currency equal to 33 kilos of gold. So it was a lot of money. Now here's the thing. If you have $360 million in wealth lying around in some sort of spendable form, like, gold coins, it's easy to spend, and that money just has a way of spending itself. But if your money is in the form of large sheets of bronze, well, that's not so easy to spend. And if you don't need to spend that money, having your money tied up in large metal sheets is sort of like having it in a savings account. It's there when you need it, but you really have to need it to go through the process of selling it or converting it into a more spendable form. Now, if you remember back to the episode in which I talked about the Golden Age of Athens, episode 78, I talked about the sculptor Helios making a colossal statue of Athena to go inside the Parthenon, and it's called the Athena Parthenos. The Athena Parthenos was a chryselephantine statue, meaning it was made out of ivory and gold. And it was big, about 37 feet tall, and employing about a ton of gold in its creation. Now, one of the purposes of this statue, apart from deity worship, was as an ostentatious yet safe display of wealth. That ton of gold was on display for everyone to see, yet for no one to take. No one is going to steal a 37-foot statue very easily. At the same time, the wealth was always there in case the Athenians needed it. But it would really have to be an emergency for the Athenians to decide to part with the statue. Eventually, they did just that. They removed the gold bits and replaced them with gilt bronze, and then used the gold to help pay for the Peloponnesian Wars. So, with no immediate need for that wealth, the people of Rhodes decided to follow the example of Phidias and Athens and create a statue out of the bronze they had harvested from the siege machines. It would be a tremendous job for any sculptor, but the Rhodians knew just who to turn to, one of their own, the sculptor Chares, from the village of Lindos on the south coast of the island of Rhodes. Chares of Lindos was a pupil of none other than the great Lysippus, the favored sculptor of Alexander the Great. And among the hundreds of statues Lysippus was known to have made in his very long career, several of those statues were colossal bronze statues. Most notably, in the decade before the siege of Rhodes, from 314 to 304, Lysippus is thought to have been working in the city of Tares, now known as Taranto, on the Italian peninsula. and he was working on two colossal bronze statues. One of them was a seated Heracles, about 7 meters high, and the other a standing Zeus, a full 18 meters or 60 feet high. Though neither survive, as I mentioned, these were known to be cast in bronze. Now, naturally, these statues would have been cast in sections and riveted together, or otherwise assembled in some way. We don't really know how he did it. But the point is, Lysippus knew how to create enormous statuary successfully. And if he was in Taranto around 310 or so making these works, they would have been some of his last works. He would have been in his 80s by that point. So, with little else by the way of evidence to go on, it seems reasonable that Chares of Lindos could easily have been one of the many assistants who helped the aging Lysippus create these works. In fact, it's hard to imagine the city of Rhodes entrusting the work of a bronze colossus to anyone less experienced. And what did the city of Rhodes ask for? They wanted a bronze statue 33 meters tall, or about 105 feet high, in the figure of the Greek deity, Helios, the Titan who drives the chariot of the sun across the sky. Helios was the patron deity of Rhodes, just as Athena was for Athens. This statue was destined to be the tallest statue built in antiquity, a symbol of the triumph of the prosperity and good fortunes of Rhodes. Construction began in 292 BC and was completed just 12 years later, in 280 BC. Sadly, though, the statue was brought down by a large earthquake just 54 years later, in 226 BC. However, 54 years was enough time to make the statue of Helios the most famous statue in the world. In that time span, Rhodes became synonymous with the statue of Helios, like the Eiffel Tower for Paris or the Statue of Liberty for New York. In fact, when people in the ancient world spoke of the statue of Helios at Rhodes, they referred to it simply as the statue at Rhodes, or even just the statue. Kind of like how today we can speak of the David, right? It's assumed that you're speaking about the one made by Michelangelo. And when you mentioned the statue of Rhodes, everyone knew what statue you were talking about. In ancient Greek, there were several words for statue. You have agama, icon, andreas, zwanen. Now, these words are largely interchangeable, although some have slightly more specific connotations. For instance, zwanen usually referred to a statue made out of wood. Another ancient Greek word for statue was kolossos. Now, kolossos originally did not imply a large statue. Rather, its meaning implied a statue which served as a metaphysical double, closer in meaning to how we sometimes today use the word icon. But when people spoke about the Helios of Rhodes, they seemed to prefer to use the word kolossos. And that is how the Helios gained the moniker the Colossus of Rhodes, literally redefining the word colossus for all time, used to describe other large statues, but then, of course, more generally, to mean anything enormous. And for a time, the people of Rhodes themselves were sometimes identified as the Colossians, the people with the statue. So the history of the Colossus of Rhodes didn't end with its collapse. When it fell, the ruler of Egypt, who by that time was Ptolemy III, offered to pay for the statue's reconstruction. However, an oracle had proclaimed that the statue was destroyed by Helios himself, who was very displeased with the statue. So the Rhodians left the ruins of the enormous figure where it fell, broken off at the knees and lying face down. It really was just kind of too big to move, and anyway, it was still impressive enough, even as a ruin, to be a major tourist attraction in the region, as well as serving still as a depository of bronze for the city. The Colossus lay broken on the ground for the next 800 years. So even though the Colossus of Rhodes seems today like something that was short-lived, the ruins both predated and outlived the entire Roman Empire. It wasn't until 653 AD when the statue disappears forever. As part of the Arab conquests in the eastern Mediterranean, Rhodes was captured by naval forces led by the first caliph of the Umayyad Caliphate and brother-in-law to the Prophet Muhammad himself, Muawiyah I. Now, the caliph sold off the remains of the Helios of Rhodes, purportedly to a Jewish merchant from Edessa. Now, either the caliph or the merchant melted down the ruined statue in order to more easily transport the bronze, which required 900 camels to carry away. So, what did the Helios of Rhodes look like, and how was it made? Well, no one knows for sure the answer to either of those questions, though the speculation about these answers through history bears repeating. First off, let's start with the popular and enduring conception of the Colossus of Rhodes, that it was a gigantic bronze statue placed at the entrance to the harbor, standing with its legs spread so that the feet rest on either side of the harbor entrance, and ships entering the harbor would pass between the legs. It's amazing to think of, but sadly incorrect, as I mentioned. When you think about the fact that the statue was a little bit more than 100 feet high, that would mean that the maximum clearance, dead center between the statue's legs, would only be maybe 40 feet or so. And the breadth of the harbor entrance, between the feet, would have to be even less. So only small boats with low masts could pass through, and then only one at a time, and also dead center of the entrance, right? I mean, if you're just 10 feet off to one side, it might have meant crashing your mast into the inside of the statue's thigh. So anyway, that space, that little triangular space between the Colossus's legs, would have been just way too restrictive for such an important and busy harbor. And of course, it bears no relation to the scale of the harbor at Rhodes as we know it to have been. Now, at the same time, we have countless images of the Colossus of Rhodes dating back centuries, depicting the statue straddling the harbor. Now, where did that come from? Well, the legend seems to have originated with the dedicatory poem read out when the Helios was completed. And this poem was subsequently preserved by several sources, and it reads in its entirety like this. To you, O sun, the people of Dorian Rhodes set up this bronze statue reaching to Olympus, when they had pacified the waves of war and crowned their city with the spoils taken from the enemy. Not only over the seas, but also on land did they kindle the lovely torch of freedom and independence. For to the descendants of Heracles belongs dominion over sea and land. Nice little poem. So it doesn't seem like it's much to go on, right? It just says, not only over the seas, but also on land did they kindle the torch of freedom and independence. It doesn't say anything about the statue itself being over the seas and on the land. But, that's how legends start. And in the year 1395, when a passing Italian pilgrim on his way to Jerusalem stopped in at Rhodes, he recorded in his journals the legend that the local Rhodians told him about their long-gone statue. And he wrote, in ancient times there was a great wonder, a great idol, so admirably formed that it is said that it had one foot on the wharf, where the church of St. Nicholas stands, and the other on the end of the other wharf, where the windmills are. So when this Italian pilgrim by the name of Nicola di Martoni returned to Italy, his travel diary was eventually published, and it became a popular reference for Egypt and Greece and the Holy Land. And apart from his passage about the Colossus of Rhodes, Martoni's journal is actually the first detailed description we have of the Parthenon in Athens, since it was described by Pausanias in the 2nd century AD, 1,000 years earlier. Anyway, Martoni's description of the Colossus of Rhodes caught the imagination of the artists of the Renaissance, and we find illustrations of this huge statue straddling the harbor dating back to the late 15th century. It was a well-known and popular enough image that William Shakespeare, just a century later, could describe Julius Caesar in his play as bestriding the narrow world like a colossus, and we petty men walk under his huge legs. So this shows that as far away as England, this conception of the Colossus of Rhodes was circulating in the popular culture. But Nicola de Martoni's description certainly was not the earliest description of the statue. It was just the most popular. And the real frustrating thing is that while writers from Pliny the Elder to Antipater of Sidon wrote and marveled about the Colossus of Rhodes, none of them actually described what the statue looked like. All they wanted to talk about was how big it was. Here's Pliny. He says, The work that surpassed all in admiration was the colossal statue of the sun at Rhodes, made by Chares of Lindos, a pupil of Lysippus. The statue was 70 cubits high, and 66 years after its erection, it was overthrown by an earthquake. But even lying on the ground, it is a marvel. Few people can get their arms around its thumb, and the fingers are larger than most statues. Vast caves yawn within its fractured limbs, while inside one sees great masses of rock, which he used to stabilize it when he erected it. And, that's about all we get from Pliny. Though, to be fair, he never went to Rhodes, and never saw the ruins lying on the ground himself. The Colossus of Rhodes was mentioned even earlier than Pliny, although pretty briefly, about a century after the statue fell, by Antipater of Sidon, when he wrote about having seen the 7 wonders of the world. Just as an aside, it's kind of an amazing thing that, the idea of the 7 wonders, the 7 wonders of the world, that goes back as far as the 1st century BC. In Greek, they were known as the 7 themata, or 7 sights. It is basically the world's first bucket list of things to see before you die. The Colossus of Rhodes, within that group of 7, is the youngest item on that bucket list, the last one to come about, and it was also the first one to fall into ruin. So the 7 wonders of the world all coexisted intact only for a period of 54 years. Now, going beyond Pliny and Antipater, there is one first-hand account of the ruins of the Colossus which gives us more information than any other first-hand source. It comes from a man who called himself Philo of Byzantium. Now, Philo of Byzantium was a well-known figure, and he was also known as Philo Mechanicus, because he was a prolific writer of many treatises dealing with mechanics and physics and engineering. And one written work bearing his name is titled De Septem Mundi Miraculis, or On the 7 Wonders of the World. And it's where we find the description of the Helios. But there's a problem. It is pretty certain that Philo of Byzantium, or Philo Mechanicus, did not actually write this work. The text leaves stylistic clues that it was written much later, probably in the 4th century AD rather than in the 2nd century BC. It's a little like if, say, Stephen King decided to write a novel and then sign it with the name of William Shakespeare. You'd be able to tell it wasn't Shakespeare when you read it. So, either someone in the 4th century AD was also named Philo of Byzantium, which, is entirely possible, or either that or someone wanted to lend credibility to their own work by signing it with the name of a well-respected author from the past. Now, either of these could be true. In any case, today, scholars refer to the author of the 7 Wonders of the World as Pseudo-Philo of Byzantium. Anyway, no matter who wrote it or when, it does seem to contain some fascinating and perhaps even plausible insight into how the Colossus of Rhodes was built. It's also specific enough that it was probably written by someone who saw and explored the ruins of the Colossus firsthand. Now here's what Pseudo-Philo had to say. Having built a base of white marble, he first fixed upon it the feet of the Colossus up to the ankle joints, bearing in mind the symmetria of a god intended to stand to a height of 70 cubits. For the sole of the foot was already longer than other statues are high. For this reason, it was impossible to hoist up the remainder and place it upon the feet, but the ankles had to be cast upon them. And, as when a house is being built, the whole work had to rise up upon itself. And so, while other statues are first modeled, then dismembered for casting in parts, then finally recomposed and erected, in this case, when the first part had been cast, the second was modeled upon it, and when this had been cast, the third was built upon it, and the next again was done according to the same technique, for the individual metal sections could not be moved. When a new section had been cast upon those already completed, the spacing of the tie bars and the joints of the framework were taken care of, and the stability of the stone blocks placed inside it was ensured. In order to keep the plan of operations on a firm footing throughout, he heaped up a huge mound of earth around the completed limbs, burying the finished work and carrying out the next section of casting on that level. So having thus ascended little by little to the summit of his hopes, and having expended 500 talents of bronze and 300 of iron upon it, he made a god to equal the god, and produced by his daring a mighty work, for he had given the world a second sun to match the first. Okay, kind of a long and convoluted quote, using old-timey language, so let me parse this out a bit. What Pseudo-Philo is saying is that Chares of Lindos and his workers started with a marble base and then attached the bronze feet to that up to the height of the ankles. But at that point, how do you build the rest of the statue when even the ankles are higher than your head? Chares apparently heaped earth all around the feet, effectively burying those feet, which made the ankles now at ground level. Now all you had to do was add and attach the next sections of the statue to the first, and then bury those sections and work your way up until the statue is done, and then you have to dig the thing out. Now, as the statue rose, the lower parts of the inside of the statue were tied together with iron rods and filled with rock for stability and weight. And this description matched what Pliny had recorded, after all, right? That the ruins of the statue were filled with rock. Now, the real genius of this construction was in solving the problem of having to move large cast sections up onto the ever-growing statue. Remember, it was over 100 feet high. So according to Pseudo-Philo, Chares eliminated the need for moving these big cast parts simply by casting each section of the statue directly on top of the last section. So, on top of the ankles, Chares would model and wax the calves of the statue and then bury those wax calves in the dirt. Doing so effectively created a mold using the dirt around the wax, which would then be melted out and bronze poured in. You then dig out the dirt from inside the hollow, now bronze calf, reinforce it from the inside, fill it with rocks, and then you start to model the next section, the knees, on top of the calves. It's kind of an intriguing solution, but one which also raises more issues than it might solve. I mean, what about the shrinkage rates of bronze, for example, right? Wouldn't the proportions of the statue diminish as you went up if you were modeling the new sections to fit the already cast bronze ones? And wouldn't you have to build a new foundry furnace for each section you cast on top of the ever-growing mound of dirt? So many art historians who understand the technical processes involved cast doubt, pun intended, on Pseudo-Philo's description, especially as it was recorded centuries after the work actually took place. And without the artifact of the sculpture itself, we'll just never know for sure. Though, for me, I think it could have worked, although don't ask me for details as to exactly how. It's just that I think that without the evidence of the sculpture, it's easier to cast doubt on such a remarkable and innovative solution. It kind of reminds me of, actually, Filippo Brunelleschi's amazing feat of building the cupola of the Duomo. It was the largest dome ever built up to that time, without the use of scaffolding, and with a unique system of interlocking bricks and stone chains. But I think if the cupola were not still intact and, available to be studied, I think many art historians would doubt the written records of the methods Brunelleschi used, because they were just so unprecedented and novel and unique. So, faced with the impossibility of knowing for sure, I am inclined to give Pseudo-Philo the benefit of the doubt. If you go to the image gallery for this episode 87, at thesculptorsfuneral.com, you will find several historical illustrations of what various artists through history have imagined the Colossus looking like. And they are all very different from each other. Some actually don't even show the statue bestriding the harbor. But most illustrations do have a few things in common. The statue is generally depicted with an upraised hand, either supporting a torch or shielding the figure's eyes as he stares towards the sun. And additionally, most depictions show rays or spikes emanating from the head of Helios. This is known as a solar crown. Now let's talk about these attributes, this torch and this solar crown. Now, like the bestriding pose, the torch motif originates with the dedication poem. The part where it says, "Not only over the seas, but also on land, did they kindle the torch of freedom and independence." Wow. the torch of freedom and independence. Sounds like something you would hear in America on the 4th of July. And of course, the sculptor Auguste Bartholdi, when he created the Statue of Liberty, borrowed this torch motif for his own Colossus. And he didn't stop there, of course. Also notable on the Statue of Liberty is her solar crown, spikes emanating from it like rays of the sun. Now, these references were intentional and overt. The Statue of Liberty, when constructed in the 1880s, was the largest metal statue ever erected and the largest since the Colossus of Rhodes. Lady Liberty's own dedication poem, written by Emma Lazarus, you know the one that says, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." Well, the title of that poem is The New Colossus. In fact, the first lines of that poem directly reference the Colossus of Rhodes, calling it the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs, astride from land to land. I recommend giving the episode in which I discuss the Statue of Liberty a listen if you haven't already heard it, by the way, especially if you're into big statues. How the Statue of Liberty was constructed is quite an interesting story. Now, out of all the wild guesses artists have made about the look of Helios of Rhodes, one thing they probably got right is the idea of rays emanating from the statue's head. It was a common motif in the depiction of Helios before the statue was made, and we even find on coins which were minted in Rhodes the head of Helios with those same rays. In fact, the head of Helios depicted on Rhodian coins may indeed be a portrait of the head of the statue itself. You see, back in the ancient world, locally minted coins were more than just portable wealth. As coins were traded for goods across the Mediterranean and beyond, they became advertisements for the lands from which they came. You might have never even heard of the island of Rhodes until you held one of their coins in your hand. Naturally, any entity minting their own coins would want to use that tiny little disc in your hand to show off the best of what their country had to offer, or maybe what their country was famous for. So in addition to, the usual rulers putting their own heads on their coins out of vanity, places like Olympia in Greece would put an image of their own wonder of the world, the statue of Zeus by Phidias. Those coins are in fact the principal means by which we know what the statue of Zeus looked like. And Rhodes might have done the same thing for their Colossus, though sadly for us, if they did, they only depicted the head and not the whole statue. Even so, the head depicted on Rhodian coins, if it is indeed a portrait of the statue, might give a rather interesting clue as to the physical nature of the Colossus. I've got an image of those coins at the image gallery, and it really is worth taking a look, because you might find that head on the coin familiar. Shaggy, wavy hair, a beardless face, a round chin, and Cupid's bow lips. All very similar to the portraits made by Lysippus, who was the master of Caries of Lindos, of none other than Alexander the Great. Now, these coins support a theory, of course unprovable, that the Colossus of Rhodes may have resembled Alexander the Great himself. It's an attractive theory, if for no other reason than both the Colossus and Alexander were as monumental and world-changing as they were short-lived. Well, thanks for listening. As always, you can check out additional content at the Sculptor's Funeral website, sculptorsfuneral.com, or on our YouTube channel and on our Facebook group page. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or, all the dozens of podcast apps out there and receive the podcast automatically on your PC, tablet, or mobile device as soon as new episodes air. And if you want to help the podcast reach other people, leave a review, please, or give the podcast a rating wherever you subscribe. Also, as always, at the sculptorsfuneral.com website, you can stream the complete archives of the show. You can also check out the image galleries for this and other episodes. You can support the podcast by buying some Sculptor's Funeral merchandise or by making a donation. And doing so helps support the podcast, and for that, I thank you. Thanks again for listening. Have a productive week.